Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. War fighting. My correspondents for war fighting over this vast landscape from North Africa all the way to the Hindu Kush are Tom Joscelyn and Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. They keep the Long War Journal. You follow the Long War Journal and you'll see the conflict is constant, it's argumentative, it's political, it moves across Europe, Africa, Asia. It involves all of the major players when the United States shows up, and we're going to begin with the U.S. tonight. Mr. Roggio is reporting within these last days the U.S. claim of 10,000 Islamic State fighters killed since the start of the air war campaign. I remind you all, that was a speech made by the President of the United States in the fall of 2014. Bill, a very good evening to you. 10,000 Islamic State fighters killed. There are a number of ways to approach this. Ironically, I try a version of my youth. Once upon a time, when the Vietnam War was the story of the day, the hour, the United States pouring lots of young men into the Vietnam conflict with no end in sight, the Pentagon, in order to make everyone in the United States feel that we were making progress, would report a casualty number, daily, weekly, monthly, the dead among the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese or their allies in Cambodia and the other states. And that number was always suspect. At the time and then afterwards, it was revealed that the number had no basis. In fact, it was pretty much a combination of people's assumptions, guesses, and sometimes deception. That number was called swag. Stupid, wild, a guess. Swag. Does that term of art exist in the 21st century? Is this an example of swag? A very good evening to you, Bill.
Good evening, John. Yeah, the term still does exist. I've heard it used several times. I've heard it used in reference to this. I think, to me, what's more interesting about the number itself, and I agree, I think this is certainly an attempt by the Pentagon to say, look, we're having success, while Ramadi falls, while the city of Palmyra in Syria falls to the Islamic State, the U.S. military is anxious to show any measure of success. So they went back to the old standby of body counts, and that's with their possibly with swag. Now, if that number is true, let's say let's take them at their word and say the number of 10,000 Islamic State fighters were killed. Last summer, the CIA estimated the Islamic State. First, they said around 10,000. Then, as the Islamic State advanced throughout Iraq and Syria, by the midsummer, they were saying somewhere around 20,000 to 31,500 Islamic State fighters incomplete. So, if that number is true, and let's just assume it's static and whatnot, does that mean we killed a third and a half to the Islamic State fighters? And if that's true, how is it that they are continuing to defeat Iraqi security forces? They continue to take control of cities and towns. They're battling on multiple fronts against two militaries and multiple militias, including the Peshmerga and the Kurd YPG and the PKK, and you name it. The as well as going up against their Islamist rivals like the Nusra Front and Ahrar al-Sham and other groups and Syrian rebel groups. How is this? I mean, look, we said, both Tom and I said last year, that number has to be way low. And, I made a very conservative estimate of 50,000 and always felt that it was much, much higher given the amount of territory they were holding and the number of fronts they were fighting on. And, when you put all that together and you have the combat support and all, you guys have to take leave and people are wounded or killed, the number has to be somewhere around 10,000. So really, to me, the real story is how wrong did the U.S. intelligence community get the estimate of the Islamic State?
Good question. We'll finish that when we do the books 30 or 40 years from now. Mr. Joscelyn, a very good evening to you. The second part of the interview with Jelani, who did not show his face. And I go to a detail in it, Tom, that caught my attention right away in your careful reporting. When asked about the numbers of foreigners in al-Nusra, this is the al-Qaeda version in the Syrian civil war, he estimated that 3 out of 10 are coming from outside, foreigners, people traveling from Europe or North Africa. That leaves 7 out of 10. And you observe that is significant in that for the first time, I believe, or certainly early days, we understand that al-Nusra is a Syrian phenomenon. Do I read this correctly?
Well, that's right, John, but we've understood it to be a mainly Syrian phenomenon all along. I mean, I took that language to basically confirm what our reading of the situation, which is, and this is really grossly misunderstood, I think, in a lot of the analyses of al-Qaeda. What they've been trying to do, particularly in the wake of the post-Arab Spring of 2011, so-called Arab Spring, is to basically inculcate its ideology. Al-Qaeda is trying to inculcate its ideology in these local populations that are involved in these uprisings, insurgencies against the local governments. And they've been a lot more successful at that than people give them credit for. And the Nusra Front, if you recall, didn't announce itself on the scene as al-Qaeda originally. They were just trying to say that they're basically this front for victory in Syria against the Assad regime. And, oh, by the way, we hold to this jihadist ideology and we want a radical Islamic State to replace the Assad regime. So that was their strategy all along, was to basically hide their intentions, hide what they were doing, and sort of ingrain themselves into this insurgency against the Assad regime. And what Giuliani's interview confirms is that they've had success in doing that 7 out of 10 members in the organization are Syrians, and that they're actually building up a lot of support amongst the local population. And in fact, if you look at their propaganda daily, like as we do, what you see is that basically for every image of war fighting you see, or I'll say for every 2 images of war fighting you'll see one image of what they call their dawah or schooling activities, charitable activities and schooling activities throughout Syria, where they're raising the next generation of jihadists. And Giuliani talks about this, and this to me is the probably the scariest part of his interview, because what they're talking about is generational warfare, and we still don't think like that.
The fact that Giuliani doesn't show his face, is that has any significance? What is he thinking of? How does he imagine himself in the future? Is he looking to be a member of the government?
It has to do with basically the threat of him being killed. Al-Qaeda's realized a long time ago that essentially the guys you put on camera, you show their face, those are the ones that you're increasing the likelihood they're going to be killed. And so, really the success of the drone campaign is taking out a lot of the guys that Al-Qaeda is willing to show us for one reason or another. Giuliani knows this, and in fact, at the end of the interview, he and the interviewer mock the CIA and basically say, well, I'm not showing my face because I don't want the CIA to have a clean picture of me. And so that's a sort of a hat tip to the CIA to say, we know you're trying to drone me or kill me with a missile strike. We're not going to let that happen. Now, they still could get him in a variety of other ways, of course, but the whole point here is this is operational security. He's trying to protect his identity as much as he can, given the many threats to his security he has.
Bill, quickly, you have an item up at Long War Journal about Sistani, the Grand Ayatollah in Iraq, giving a Martyrdom Medal of Honor to a man who leads the Imam Ali Brigade. What is striking about this, he's a quite beefy character. He looks like he lifts weights or uses steroids or eats a lot, is that you also have a picture of this decorated individual standing next to a Russian multiple rocket launch system. What lesson do we draw from this, Bill?
Yeah, the Russians have been providing those rocket systems that the militias like to use to bombard Sunni towns before they go in. The lesson here is that the Shia militias, this Imam Ali Brigade, is led by a specially designated global terrorist, or it's directed by a specially designated global terrorist named Abu Mahdi al-Muhannis. He's been described as a advisor to Qasem Soleimani, who's the head of Quds Force. This commander who was decorated serves under Muhandis. The lesson here is, look, Sistani and his people, they're no friends of Iran. However, because we have the differing views on how religion and politics intersect, and however, even they are forced to recognize these militias. I think it's a evidence of a growing radicalization among the moderate elements in the Shia political world, because these militias are being hailed as the saviors of Iraq. This commander, this Abu Azrael, he received the commendation of martyrdom, even though he's alive. It doesn't make sense, but regardless, that's what they gave him. And they're commending this commander who fights for basically what is a terrorist organization and is recognized as such. So I think the longer people always say, "Oh, just let these Shia groups and let Iran and let the and let the Islamic State fight it out and they kill each other. They do kill each other, but what they wind up doing is radicalizing everyone around them. And I think this is just sort of the canary in the coal mine in this part.
Bill Roggio and Tom Joscelyn of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We'll be back with more war fighting in a moment. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm John Batchelor. Bill Roggio and Tom Joscelyn of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. They keep the Long War Journal. And we began with a report of the Pentagon boasting of how many Islamic State fighters it has killed since the beginning of the air war campaign in late 2014. The Islamic State, however, finds it easy to recruit and to expand its battle space, not only against the Iraq government, such as it is, or the, as Bill reports, the Shia brigades that are increasingly the Iraq army, but also against its rivals. And we go to a very large, important city, Aleppo province, Aleppo city. This is northwest Syria, approximately near the Turkish border. And Bill and Tom Joscelyn's reporting on war fighting here that is dirty war fighting between the Islamic State and rival groups. Who are these rival groups? Who do they identify with? Is this versions of al-Nusra or other directions, Tom? Good evening again.
No, good evening again, John. What happened is in Aleppo, we have other rebel groups, in particular a coalition known as the Levant Front, which was holding territory and fighting for additional territory from the Assad regime. And basically, the Islamic State did what they always do, which is they came in behind these rebel groups that are fighting the Assad regime and try and take their territory away from them. This is, in fact, how the Islamic State built its so-called caliphate in Syria, on the Syrian side of the border in the first place. Raqqa, which is the capital of the caliphate, actually wasn't, quote-unquote, liberated by the Islamic State from the Assad regime. Actually, other groups did that. The Islamic State then came in and basically took it away from them. They try to do the same thing here in Aleppo, and they try to move against the Levant Front, which is sort of a coalition of several groups. There's this dizzying array of coalitions in Syria to keep track of, and the Levant Front is one of them in and around Aleppo. Now, what happened is this set off a chain of events where other organizations then sent in their reinforcements to battle the Islamic State, and in fact, several prominent al-Qaeda scholars actually issued a fatwa saying that it was the duty of Muslims in Aleppo and throughout Syria, in fact, to basically push back the Islamic State's aggression in Aleppo against the other rebel groups. And so what you've had now is that al-Qaeda's group in Syria, the al-Nusra Front, and its allies have actually redeployed forces to Aleppo to battle the Islamic State. So once again, we have a contest in Syria with al-Qaeda on one side and its allies against the Islamic State on the other.
The Levant Front and others you name here, the Syrian opposition, are they drifting back and forth between the Islamic State and al-Nusra? Are they in the middle ground, targeted by both sides?
Levant Front was firmly against the Islamic State. You always have maybe some factions within a group who could go one way or the other, but the Levant Front overall is very much in the anti-Islamic State camp, and they're basically an ally of the al-Nusra Front. There was some reporting that one of the groups of Nusra Front cleared out late last year and early this year, Harakat Hazim, which was backed by the West. After they were wiped out by the al-Nusra Front, the remnants of that group may have joined the Levant Front. So you do have parts of the Levant Front that are actually against the al-Nusra Front as well. But overall, basically what you have is an organization or a coalition that's more in line or more on the side at the moment with the al-Nusra Front than the Islamic State.
You describe... Well, it actually begins to look like the Terminator landscape of, what is that, the 22nd, 21st century, in which there are independent groups preying on each other inside a failed state. I take it that in Aleppo province there's no presence of the Assad regime, of the Alawite army. They've completely abandoned this, and so what we're witnessing here is gang warfare, vast gangs, but gang warfare. Is that how to read this? There's no state opposing them. These are gangsters within a failed part of Syria.
I think it's a fair analogy. I mean, the Assad regime definitely still has some presence in Aleppo. Of course, they were bombing rebel groups that were fighting the Islamic State, which is part of the reason why we've seen it alleged and charged that the Islamic State has a deal with the Assad regime, because they're both once again fighting the same enemies. And I think I don't think there's like a formal agreement between the two sides, between the Islamic State and the Assad regime, but I do think there's sort of a de facto sort of alliance of interest that they they enter into pretty commonly, pretty often, because basically the Islamic State isn't really interested in fighting along the front lines against the Assad regime. They're interested in taking territory away from other rebel groups and consolidating their control over territory and expanding in the areas that they can. And sort of the other rebel groups, prominently Al-Qaeda and its allies, basically stand in the way. They're sort of a wedge between the two sides, between the Assad regime and the Islamic State. So it gets very complicated. And the Islamic State strategy so far, however, has been to basically put forward its own interests, sort of consolidate its power over its own so-called caliphate, and not really spend all of its resources going after the Assad regime.
Bill, you have a report of an English-language video emphasizing that jihadists to the Islamic State are coming from the Balkans. What's the significance of this? Why do they want us to know this?
This is but of a piece from the Islamic State. They really enjoy highlighting their foreign fighters. They've done this numerous times. We're starting to see a lot more from the one from the Balkans is certainly interesting. We're seeing a lot more from the Islamic State, from the Uyghurs or the jihadists from China. We're seeing them, they've been touting suicide bombers from a host of countries, including England, France, Holland, you name it. They pretty much have a suicide bomber from there. But this one is interesting because the people forget that there were indeed jihadists fighting in the 1990s to establish an Islamic State, and these jihadists are still angry that part of the agreement for ending the war was to eject all of the Islamist fighters from the area. So it's something they bear a grudge over to this day. And and these are fighters that are experienced, and they certainly contribute to the fighting prowess of the Islamic State.
And Tom, why does the Islamic State want us to know it's an international group? Is this who's the audience for this? Who does it impress?
Well, there are multiple audiences for this. I mean, but it goes down to the foundational sort of structure and mythology or mythos of the Islamic State. Remember, if they are the caliphate as they try and proclaim themselves to be, and have said they are, then they have to give you this sense that they are this ever-expanding territorial menace that's basically going to take over everything, and that they have a presence throughout the globe, and that basically they're drawing in fighters from all these different areas. And there's some truth to the propaganda claims, of course, because they do have fighters coming in from the Balkans. They have increased their presence in places like North Africa, for example. But they want to give you this sense at all times that they're expanding in every way you can imagine. And this all feeds into that mythos of the Islamic State as the caliphate, that they have this worldwide presence.